Powerful prophecies are presently poised to roll off their ancient parchments and pound down on the pavement and pack a powerful global punch, especially in the Middle East. Among them is Ezekiel 38 and 39. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is a marquee event of the end times, through which God will put the world on official notice that he's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise-keeping God of all those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. Through Ezekiel 38 and 39, God is going to make his holy name known. So today we're going to talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39, specifically the timing of Ezekiel 38 and 39. When it comes to the timing of Ezekiel 38 and 39, there are diverse opinions about that. Some, like myself, put it before the 7-year tribulation, while others connect it to Armageddon during the tribulation period. So today we're going to look at some specific details to see if we can pinpoint with a fair degree of certainty the timing of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Approximately 2,500 years ago, Ezekiel chapter 38, 1 through 6, identified a coalition that at some future point would come to invade Israel for plunder and for booty. You see on the map there, identified by their ancient names, the belligerents that will be in this coalition. You have Magog, Gomer, Meshech, Togarmah, Tubal, Put, Libya, Cush, and Persia. The modern-day equivalents of these populations, the general consensus is it would include Russia, probably some of the southern steppes of Russia, those countries there. Turkey's definitely in there, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, perhaps Morocco, Tunisia. Some even suggest Germany may be part of this coalition. It's important to note, though, they form an outer ring of countries that don't share common borders with Israel. And none of these countries have ever been Israel's notorious enemies. And it does not include the notorious enemies of Israel from time immemorial and even in modern day. There's no Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. So it's important to notice that as we go forward with this study. So when it comes to the timing of Ezekiel 38, there's one thing we can know with absolute certainty, is that it will happen in the latter years. We're told that in Ezekiel 38, verse 8, which says, "After many days you will be visited in the latter years. You will come into the land of those brought back from the sword, and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely." So the world hourglass made its final spin on May 14th, 1948, when Israel became a nation and the Jews started to flock back into their homeland. That's when the end times time clock started ticking. More confirmation of that comes from verse 16, which tells us, "You will come up against my people Israel, like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes." So that we clearly see that it happens in the latter years or latter days. Similarly, another theme that's brought out in verse 16 is that God is going to be hallowed in this event, and we'll talk more about that because it will help us understand the timing. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly in another verse. So we've established that the prophecy will find fulfillment in the latter years, and that we are actually living in those latter years presently. It looks from world events like this prophecy could find fulfillment in the very near future. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have been growing their relationship stronger ever since the Syrian Revolution. They met on numerous occasions to discuss their national interests in the reformation of Syria after that revolution has happened. So we see that this prophecy seems to be setting up to happen in the near future. However, there are some prerequisites that we need to look at to see if Israel is dwelling in the conditions for this to find fulfillment. They must be meeting all these prerequisite conditions in order for this prophecy to find fulfillment. One, they must be regathered from the nations in the latter years, brought back from the sword into Israel, which had long been desolate. And we would say, yes, that has been happening already since 1948. But there's some other ones we have to look at here too. And these have not necessarily found fulfillment just yet. There's still prerequisites. They have to be a peaceful people, living in a land of unwalled villages, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, having silver, gold, and having acquired livestock and goods, possessing booty and great plunder, because, of course, that's what Russia's coming after. Presently, Israel is not dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates. They have a partition wall through the center of Israel that keeps out Palestinian terrorism. It's approximately 403 miles. At some point, it's 20 feet tall, filled with concrete. So we can say they're not actually dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates. Matter of fact, in the Middle East is the most fenced-in and fortified region in the world, and Israel within that is the most fenced-in and fortified nation within the Middle East. We're also told that they must be dwelling securely. It shows up 2 times, dwelling securely or dwelling safely. We find it in Ezekiel 38, verse 8, and Ezekiel 38, verse 11. The Hebrew word is Yeshav B'tak, and it says, the Jews were brought out of the nations, and all of them dwell safely, Yeshav B'tak. You will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go up to a peaceful people who dwell safely, Yeshav B'tak. All of them dwelling without walls, bars, and having neither bars nor gates. Now, Yeshav B'tak, the Hebrew word definition is a security that dwells safely because of a military capability. You've defeated your enemies, now you can dwell securely. You can tear down the walls, bars, or gates. So now let's turn back the pages in Ezekiel 38 to chapter 28, 10 chapters prior, to find out why Israel is not dwelling securely and when Israel will dwell securely. We're told in Ezekiel 28, verse 24, why they're not dwelling securely is because, and there's a pricking briar or a painful thorn, Ezekiel says, all around them. Here's what it says, and there shall no longer be a pricking briar or a painful thorn for the house of Israel from among all who are around them, who despise them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord God. And you see that there's a map up there of those around them who despise them. They actually are part of a Psalm 83 prophecy we'll talk about briefly in a moment. But they serve as a pricking briar or a painful thorn. That's why Israel can't dwell securely. Verses 25 and 26 tells us when they will be able to dwell securely, when that pricking briar and painful thorn will be taken care of. And here's what it says in Ezekiel 28, verses 25 and 26. Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely, Yeshav B'tak. They'll build houses and plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely. But when I have executed judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God. So this is why they can't dwell securely. They've got a pricking briar and painful thorn around about them. Ultimately, they will be a vineyard planting, home building, safe dwelling nation, but judgments have to be executed upon those around them who despise them before that can happen. So let's take a closer look at that pricking briar and painful thorn round about Israel, those enemies who despise Israel that will need judgments executed upon them before Israel can dwell securely, before Ezekiel 38 can find fulfillment. They form an inner circle of countries. You see them up there called Lebanon, Syria, of course Hezbollah is in Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan. The Palestinians would be included, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Gaza area where the Hamas are. They're all part of another prophecy in Psalm 83, the Psalm 83 Confederacy. They form an inner circle of countries, not like the outer ring of Ezekiel 38. These are an inner circle that share common borders with Israel. And about 3,000 years ago, Asaph the psalmist tells us that by their ancient names, you see on this map, superimposed upon their modern-day equivalents, and Edomites and Ammonites and Moabites, etc. That's who they identified back 3,000 years ago. But you saw the list of who they are today. They are the pricking briar and painful thorn round about Israel. Now, Psalm 83 tells us in verse 4 the motive of this confederacy. It says, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. Their goal is they want to take for themselves the pastures of God, we're told in verse 12, for their possession, Psalm 83, verse 12. So that in today's scenario. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution without the Jews. They want another Arab state called Palestine, if this is a modern-day prophecy, which I believe it is for our time. Ultimately, they're going to make a final siege on Judah and Jerusalem, this pricking briar and painful thorn round about Israel. We're told in Zechariah 12, verse 2, Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, and they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. So they're going to make a final attempt to take over Judah and Jerusalem and a final siege the nations round about, not the nations at large, to be clear about that. Every translation tells us like it's either surrounding peoples, New King James, peoples round about, American Standard, surrounding nations, NET, surrounding peoples, nearby nations. Clearly we're talking about the pricking briar and painful thorn that shares common borders with Israel, the enemies of Israel from time immemorial that fought against them in 1948, 1967, 1973, and currently the wars with Hezbollah and Hamas, etc. It's those peoples round about. I've actually written an article you can get at prophecydepot.com on this Zechariah 12 called The War Before Armageddon. I invite you to read that article to get a clearer understanding on Zechariah 12 and the final conclusion of the Arab-Israeli conflict is spelled out. And here's how it will conclude according to verse 6 in Zechariah 12. God's going to empower the Israeli defense forces to defeat that enemies around them. This will be the judgments executed upon them. The tool will be the Israeli defense forces. We're told in that day that they make that final siege on Judah and Jerusalem, I, the Lord, will make the governors of Judah, read that as the captains of the Israeli defense forces, of Judah like a firepan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, but Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place. So that's how the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to conclude. That's how the pricking briar and painful thorn will be eliminated. That's when Israel can become a safe-dwelling, home-building, vineyard-planting nation. And that's when Ezekiel 38 can happen. You see, on the right hand and on the left hand, they will be devoured, according to Zechariah 12, verse 6. So when it comes to the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF being used as a tool by the Lord in biblical prophecy, they're involved in several prophecies you can see here on this screenshot where you got. The Israeli Defense Forces are involved with versus Iran, although they're not specifically identified in the prophecy. That's in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39, the prophecy of Elam. They're likely going to be involved in that, but they are identified clearly versus Syria, number 2. You see the supporting scriptures there on the right side with each one. Versus the Gaza, where the Hamas are. The Palestinians. IDF versus Lebanon, where the Hezbollah are. IDF versus Jordan. IDF versus Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And we just read Zechariah 12:6, all the hostile neighbors, the pricking briar and painful thorn. Now I identify these as pre-tribulation prophecies for the following reason. When you understand the tribulation period, in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, Israel's not fighting any wars. They're living in a condition of peace. It's brought about by the covenant of Daniel 9:27. It's a false peace because it's going to be violated at the mid part of the tribulation period, but they'll be complacent. They won't be fighting wars during that period of time. Matter of fact, they won't be able to stop the Antichrist at that point even from going into the temple and desecrating it, which happens at the mid part of the tribulation after 3.5 years. And then the second part of the tribulation, also known as the Great Tribulation, they're fleeing for their lives because the Antichrist is committing genocide, the final genocidal attempt against the Jews, in which we're told in Zechariah 13:8, 2/3 of the Jews in the land will be cut off, they will be killed. So it's important to note that the Israeli Defense Forces are involved in the pre-tribulation wars. They're not fighting in the tribulation. So we find out that the Israeli Defense Forces in Psalm 83 and the related prophecies are involved in the pre-tribulation, but it's Ezekiel 38 involved in a pre-tribulation time frame as well. It's not the same prophecy as Psalm 83, so you have to make the distinction here. There's clearly distinctions and differences between Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. Psalm 83 involves Arabs versus Jews, versus Ezekiel 38 is from predominantly non-Arab countries, predominantly Muslim, but not necessarily Arabs, versus Jews. There's also Different enemies, you got the inner circle we talked about versus the outer ring. The goal of Psalm 83 is to take the land, the promised land, for possession. That's not the same goal as Ezekiel 38. They want to take plunder and booty. The different defeats, the Israeli defense forces are the tool used, as we just discussed, to defeat the Arab foes. But the Lord supernaturally, we'll look at this shortly, defeats the Ezekiel 38 invaders. The different results in the end analysis, the ancient hatred of the Arabs and the Jews will be done after Psalm 83. But Ezekiel 38, God plans to make the world know His holy name. We'll talk about that also as part of the potential pre-tribulation timing. So as I just mentioned, there are distinct differences, especially the defeats of Psalm 83 versus the defeat of Ezekiel 38. We're told in Ezekiel 38 verses 19 through 23 how the Lord will supernaturally defeat the Magog invaders, the Ezekiel 38 invaders, through a great earthquake. And that great earthquake will cause panic amongst the soldiers from different nationalities. It says every man's sword will turn against its brother. Then there'll be pestilence and bloodshed and flooding rains and great hailstones and fire and brimstone. Clearly supernatural events that will be attributed toward the God of the Jews. And he will then, we're told in Ezekiel 39 verse 7, that in the aftermath of those events, the defeat, here's what's going to happen. So I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name any more. And the nations shall know I am the Lord, the Holy One, in Israel. So basically, God's going to put the world on notice that He's the holy God. He's a covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's a promise-keeping God of those who put their faith in Jesus Christ, and that will be known as a result of the supernatural defeat of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And I couldn't think of a better timing to put the world on official notice that He's God, but in a pre-tribulation time frame, because shortly thereafter in the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to come on the scene and try to convince the world that he is above all that's called God. And so basically I think this is an argument for pre-tribulation timing of Ezekiel 38. It's not one of the stronger ones, but basically I would consider this part of the reason why it could be a pre-tribulation event. So now let's look at some of the more stronger arguments for the pre-tribulation time frame of Ezekiel 38 and 39. We turn our attention to Ezekiel 39 verses 9 through 16, where we're told the following details, that in the aftermath of the supernatural defeat of the Magog invaders, the Ezekiel invaders, were told that the Israelis will burn the weapons for 7 years. They'll convert the weapons of the enemies into fuel. We're also told that they will bury the dead corpses in a valley that doesn't exist yet, but it will exist, under the name of Hamon-Gog, which means hordes of Gog in the Hebrew. They'll also be burying the dead corpses for 7 months, and in the process of doing all the above, Israel will gain world renown. Now, I'll tell you why I believe this is pre-tribulation in just a moment, but I want to let you know that recently I collaborated with Prophecy Watchers and Mano Gonzalez to put together the most exhaustive teaching and video teaching, 4 discs on Ezekiel 38. It's a must-have for your video library if you're interested in Ezekiel 38 and understanding all the details about the prophecy.
The world is about to receive a shocking wake-up call. According to an ancient prophecy found in the book of Ezekiel, the God of the Bible is going to put the world on official notice that He is the one true God.
The prophet writes, "And in that day I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel."
Ezekiel foretells that in the last days, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and 6 other member nations will invade Israel from the far parts of the north. They are coming down to conquer Israel and take over its plunder and great booty. But the Lord, not America nor the Israeli Defense Forces, but the Lord, stops these invaders supernaturally with a great earthquake, pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rains, great hailstones, and fire and brimstone. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 provide every aspect of this foretold event. The stage is set, the prophecy is ready to happen, and now you can discover every detail and prepare yourself for this soon coming, powerful event. Now available, one of the most comprehensive videos ever produced on this topic, a 3-disc DVD produced by Prophecy Watchers TV, featuring Bill Salus and Mondo Gonzalez. This timely DVD is entitled Ezekiel 38, When God Defends Israel, the Coming Russian-Iranian-Led Invasion of the Promised Land, and it explains every facet of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 foretellings. You will discover the coming greater and safer Israel that someday dwells securely without walls, bars, or gates, the timing, setting, and location of the Russian-Iranian-led invasion, the identity of the invaders, the motives of these attackers, the supernatural victory by the Lord, and the aftermath period when Israel buries the dead armies and converts their weapons into energy. You will learn all this and much, much more from the Ezekiel 38 When God Defends Israel 3-disc DVD. This is by far the most exhaustive video ever produced on Ezekiel 38 and 39. You need to prepare yourself and your family for these powerful end-time events that are coming. And that's exactly what the Ezekiel 38 When God Defends Israel DVD will help you do. Pick up your copy of this powerful DVD today.
Okay, now let's look at probably one of the strongest arguments for a pre-tribulation time frame of Ezekiel 38. And we turn our attention to the converting the weapons of the invaders to fuel. We're told about this in Ezekiel 39, verses 9 and 10. So in the aftermath of the defeat, we're told this: then those who live in the towns of Israel, the Israelis, will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fuel. So they're going to have fuel from the weapons for 7 years that they'll be converting it. Now some people teach the invaders will come with these literal ancient weapons of war clubs and shields and bucklers and bows and arrows. They suggest that during the judgments in the tribulation, the cataclysmic judgments of the bowls, for instance, that the modern-day weaponry will be eliminated. But I don't think that's the case. It's not likely. Besides, you wouldn't need 7 years to convert bows and arrows into fuel. You could do that probably just a few months. So I think more likely what we're going to have here is that they'll convert the weapons that the invaders bring into fuel. Here's an example of how that's already been taking place. A couple headlines here. Megatons to megawatts, Russian warheads fuel U.S. power plants. That's in NPR back in 2013. Power from the U.S. from Russia's old nuclear weapons. That's the New York Times back in 2009. Here's another one. Russian nuclear warheads provide electricity for the U.S. for 20 years. That was back in 2021. So we can see that the technology to convert nuclear weapons and weapons, modern-day weapons into fuel is already existing. America can do it. And at that time, if not already, Israel will be able to as well. So here's one of the strongest arguments that it's a pre-tribulation time frame for a 7-year period. They can burn weapons. Many people subscribe to what I'm about to tell you. That would be Dr. Ron Rhodes, Dr. David Reagan, Dr. Ron Fruchtenbaum, myself, and many others. Because as we looked at that time frame before, on that tribulation time frame, first 3.5 years, Israel's living in that condition of peace. They could certainly be burning weapons for 3.5 years there, 3.5 out of the 7. But remember, in the mid part of the tribulation, the Antichrist goes in and starts his genocidal campaign of the Jews, and they're going to flee for their going to exile. And if anything, they'll use a weapon to defend themselves, but they won't be in a position to convert the weapons into fuel. So that you could have the general consensus would be that the conclusion of the Ezekiel 38 battle could be 3.5 years before the tribulation. They could be first half of the 7 years, 3.5 years before, and then 3.5 years within the first part of the tribulation for the 7-year time frame. So So that makes a lot of sense if you look at it that way, because they wouldn't be burning the weapons in the second half of the tribulation. It's important to note also that in the aftermath of the Ezekiel 38 defeat, supernatural defeat, while the Israelis are burning the weapons, converting them to fuel for 7 years, and bringing the dead for 7 months, that they'll be getting world renown, we're told that in Ezekiel 39, verses 9 and 10. This would not be the case in the second half of the tribulation, when they're fleeing for their lives and heading for exile. Matter of fact, most of the world at that point will be supporting the Antichrist in his genocidal campaign against the Jews. So that would also argue for a pre-tribulation timing of Ezekiel 38. So we've looked at the stage setting for Ezekiel 38. It's coming near. We see that the Russian, Turkey, Iranian relationships are stronger than ever. We see there's some preconditions, but the Israeli Defense Forces are emerging to become a tool to be used by the Lord to defeat the Arab foes. We also looked at the burning of the weapons, that the technology exists already to convert modern-day weapons into fuel. So we see that although there's some prerequisite conditions that need to be fulfilled, that pricking briar and painful thorn needs to be eliminated by the IDF. We also see that this Ezekiel 38 is stage setting for nearby fulfillment. But there's another clue we need to look at here too also in the aftermath of the defeat. We're told that there'll be a sacrificial meal, and we're told Ezekiel 39:17 the following. I find this fascinating. Speak to every sort of bird and to every beast of the field. Assemble yourselves and come. Gather together from all sides to my sacrificial meal, which I am sacrificing for you. A great sacrificial meal on the mountains of Israel, that you may eat the flesh and drink the blood. So it's interesting that in the aftermath, there'll be the sacrificial meal, and the birds ought to flock to there to be partake of it, which means they have to already be there when this happens. They can't be, migrating from Canada or somewhere like that. That would take weeks at a time. They've already got to be there. Well, guess what? They already are there. Here's some headlines you might find interesting. May 19, 2019 in May, Times of Israel. Egyptian vultures return to Carmel Mountains after 60 years. May of 2021, Times of Israel. Vultures thought extinct from Israel for 30 years, spotted twice in a month. January 2017, Jerusalem Post. Israeli vulture population is on the rise. 2007, Haaretz News. The Iraqi birds that made Aliyah. Times of Israel, 2016. Why Israel is a pilgrimage site for birds. January 2017, Haaretz says Israel's 500 million birds, the world's eighth wonder. And here's one that's relatively recently, 2022. Bird experts. Mass migration poses scary flight safety risks at Ben Gurion Airport. So we see another reason why this Ezekiel 38 and 39, the stage setting is getting very near. Even the birds are already existing over there for the sacrificial meal. Okay, we've spent time now looking at why it's highly likely that Ezekiel 38 and 39 will be a pre-tribulation event, but now let's take some time to look at why it's unlikely to be part of a tribulation event, especially an Armageddon event. We'll start with the first half of the tribulation. The tribulation starts, according to Daniel 9:27, we have this covenant that's confirmed by the Antichrist, with Israel's involved as one of the signatories, and this is what starts the 7-year tribulation period. Daniel's 70th week, also known as. And we're told that the Antichrist will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. On the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. In other words, there's going to be sacrifices and offerings going on in the Jewish temple at that time, a tribulation temple. They'll stop at the mid part of the tribulation. But in the first half of the tribulation, they're doing sacrifices and offerings and temple worship. Further support of that is in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. We're told that after the confirmation of the false covenant, John was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there," that would be the Jews, "but leave out the outer court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles." I believe that would be the harlot world religion existing at that time, not the Arabs, because they would be defeated. In Zechariah 12, as we talked about, the pricking briar, painful thorn will be eliminated. But the harlot world religion, we want to trot over Jerusalem for 3.5 years, first half of the tribulation, 42 months. So we see that what's going on in the first half of the tribulation, we don't have any hints here right now at this point, or clues that Israel is going to be involved in Ezekiel 38 invasion. The Russians are going to be coming down from the uttermost parts of the north with its hordes to invade Israel. Israel's going to be seemingly doing temple worship. The Gentiles will be trotting through Jerusalem. There's other things going on in the first half of the tribulation that give us no clues or hints that the Magog invasion is going to take place in the first half. Israel will probably be burying the Magog invaders for 7 months, converting the weapons to fuel for 7 years. There'll be signs and lying wonders. The harlot world religion of Mystery Babylon, Revelation 17, will be emerging. Should be reigning at that time. There'll be 144,000 Hebrew evangelists in Revelation chapter 7. Worldwide Christian revival in Revelation chapter 7 also. Christian martyrdom by the harlot, we're told in Revelation 17:6 that she's drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. There'll be the third Jewish temple we talked about. The 2 witnesses will be prophesying in Jerusalem at that time. There'll be some of the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, some of them. The unholy harlot and Antichrist alliance will be, it says the harlot is involved with the rides the beast, we're told in the Revelation 17, the Antichrist. The 10 kings will emerge again. There's no real clue or hint that there's going to be a Magog invasion in the first half of the tribulation. Okay, so now that we've uncovered the fact that there's no real hints or clues that Ezekiel 38 would happen during the first half of the tribulation, but what about the Armageddon Campaign? What about the second half of the tribulation? Recently I wrote an article called Are Ezekiel 38 and 39 in Armageddon? And you can access that at prophecydepot.com. I'll read the second paragraph to start this off. Although it's a minority view, there are a number of respected Bible teachers who teach the war in Ezekiel 38, 39, Zechariah 14, and Revelation 19 are part of the same war that takes place as a part of Armageddon. If they are correct, there arise a few potential problems according to the biblical text, and I'll go through what I believe those potential problems are in this segment here. So let's look at Zechariah 14 and get a clear understanding of what the Armageddon campaign starts off with. It says, Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of the battle. So basically what we have here is a successful siege on Jerusalem. Unlike Zechariah 12, the siege by the Arabs against Judah and Jerusalem, that was unsuccessful. This is highly successful. But the Lord's going to gather the nations to Jerusalem. This will happen around the start of the Armageddon campaign, getting into the second half of the tribulation. The houses will be rifled, women ravished, the city will go into captivity. So now let's look at some of the potential problems as we try to juxtapose the Magog invasion of Ezekiel 38 into the Armageddon campaign of Zechariah 14. The article, I point out the following, connecting Zechariah 14 with these problems. So when the people of Israel are living in peace, which would be Ezekiel 38 verse 14, all the nations of the earth's army, Zechariah 14:2 we just read, led by Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the rest of the Magog invaders, identified in Ezekiel 38 verses 2 through 6, they will attack Jerusalem and Israel, Ezekiel 38, 15 through 16, and Zechariah 14:2, if this is part of the same campaign. When this battle happens, God will be extremely angered, and we are told his fury will show in his face, Ezekiel 38 verses 18 through 19. So God's furious when this happens. So how will God unleash his blazing anger toward the armies on the day that they invade Israel and attack the city of Jerusalem? Shockingly, he will gather all the remaining armies that are separate from the already invading Magog nations and bring them to attack Jerusalem to successfully capture the holy city of Jerusalem. These additional armies are headed by the beast, according to Revelation 19:19, the Antichrist. Then the Lord allots some time for the armies to loot houses and rape women in Jerusalem. The Lord also allows armies some more time to take half the population of Jerusalem and send them into exile. Then after all this heinous and despicable behavior, the Lord finally decides enough already, and deploys Jesus Christ to single-handedly go out to fight against those nations. Does that make any sense, really, if you think about it? That the Lord he's furious, he's angry, he's going to gather the armies of the world to come into Jerusalem, ransack the houses, take the city captive, half the city captive, ravish the women. And that'd make God out to be a monster. No, that's not what happens. We're told what happens in his fury. He unleashes it in that day. When he's angry against Ezekiel 38, he says, "For in my jealousy," Ezekiel 38, verses 19 through 20, "in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath, I have spoken surely in that day, the day of the invasion," that time frame, "there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea and the birds of heaven, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence." Not be gathered into Jerusalem, but shake at his presence. "The mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground." And he goes on to talk about the things we talked about. The supernatural defeat, the great earthquake, the panicking, the swords against brother, pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. So that's what's going to happen in that day. When he's angry, he's going to do these things. Not gather all the armies, in my estimation, to Jerusalem to ravish the women, ransack the houses, and take half the city captive. That happens subsequent. Okay, I'm going to continue reading on in the article the 3 additional problems I found if we try to juxtapose Ezekiel 38 into the Armageddon Campaign. Problem number 1, there's 2 different and uncoordinated fronts, motives, and commanders. So if Ezekiel 38 and 39 are part of Armageddon, this would mean that at the time of Armageddon, Israel will face a massive 2-front attack. The first front has the Magog invaders attacking Israel from the north upon the mountains of Israel. They are motivated to conquer Israel for plunder and booty. The Magog invaders are commanded by a Russian leader with an evil plan. Meanwhile, on the second front, all the nations of the earth's army are attacking Jerusalem. They are ransacking homes, ravishing women, and taking control of the holy city. They're motivated to kill Israelis in the city of Jerusalem. Their mission is to commit Jewish genocide. The earth's armies are being led by the evil dictator, the Antichrist. So you'd have to make Gog the Antichrist, as some people try to do in this scenario. Problem number 2, 2 different results. The War of Armageddon, if it includes Ezekiel 38 and 39, is entirely unsuccessful. These invaders are killed in Ezekiel 38 supernaturally. Their weapons are converted into fuel for Israeli cities for 7 years. Their corpses are buried for 7 months. But on the other hand, the War of Armageddon in Zechariah 14 is totally successful. Jerusalem will be conquered. The houses get rifled and the women ravished. Also, half the city goes into captivity. Problem number 3, the 2 different defeats and burial locations. Gog, along with the hordes, are destroyed supernaturally by God by an earthquake, followed by flooding rain, great hailstone, fire and brimstone. Then they and Gog are buried in a place called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. Make note that Gog gets killed, and his future cemetery is apparently named after Gog to memorialize God's supernatural victory. Conversely, the Armageddon Campaign is defeated solely by Jesus Christ at his second coming by a sharp sword, we're told in Revelation 19:15. Perhaps this alludes typologically to a divine military scenario rather than the natural disasters in Ezekiel 38. Moreover, the Antichrist is not killed, but is cast alive in the lake of fire, whereas Gog is buried in the Valley of Hamon-Gog. So as we conclude this teaching, in my estimation, the arguments for a pre-tribulation timing of Ezekiel 38 and 39 far outweigh the tribulation potential timing for Ezekiel 38 and 39, especially in the Armageddon Campaign. But we need to rule out the millennium also. Could it happen during the millennium? Well, let's read Micah 4:3 and Isaiah 2:4 to see if we think that we can find some clues here. Micah 4:3 tells us the Lord will mediate when Christ is reigning on the earth in the millennial kingdom, messianic kingdom. This is what's going to happen. The Lord will mediate between peoples and will settle disputes among strong nations far away. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore. Isaiah says something similar, verse 4, chapter 2. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore. So we don't see any wars going on there. We don't see any converting the weapons for fuel. We see that the weapons that would have existed at the conclusion of the tribulation will be converted into agricultural implements.